Britain isn't working. A famous political poster for the Conservative Party back in the late 70s, but it feels ever more relevant today. My name's Tom Harwood, and this is the GBNews Originals series. Yes, it's hard to go about your day in the United Kingdom at the moment without feeling a sense of decay. Whether it's the shops that are boarded up, whether it's your energy bill that you get pinged through and yes, it's gone up again. Is it the prices that seem to get higher and higher? Or is it just this sense of social malaise? In whichever way you look, you might be very well forgiven for thinking Britain isn't working. Originally, that was a slogan that came up to describe the unemployment situation in the United Kingdom. That long famous line wiggling towards the unemployment office. But now it's taken on a very different site. Shall we start with energy? We should be an energy exporter in the United Kingdom. We were the country that had the first ever commercial nuclear power station that the world has ever seen. Now we're busy building the world's most expensive. We haven't completed a nuclear power station for 30 years. Now, I'm not counting, but the last one that was completed was approved by Margaret Thatcher. She died more than a decade ago. This is a serious energy crisis that the UK has hurled itself into. But it's not just nuclear power that we refuse to build, and when we do build it incredibly expensively. It's also the shale gas reserves that we sit upon in the United Kingdom. We have a wealth of shale gas beneath our feet, but what do? We keep it in the ground. A moratorium on fracking enacted by the Conservative government continued by the Labour government. And then we look to the North Sea. The North Sea reserves of oil and gas that have made Norwegians rich, that have made the Norwegian Wealth Fund one of the largest funds in the world that's worth so much to every single Norwegian citizen. Well, while the Norwegians continue to pump and drill, in the UK we've stopped exploration. Yes, that's been the policy of Ed Miliband, the new Energy Secretary. And everywhere we look, whenever we try and extract energy, whenever we try and improve the system for everyone here in the country, there are blockages placed in their way. The reams of paperwork that's needed for an environmental impact assessment to build a wind farm. Yes, you'd think that even with green and environmentally friendly forms of generating energy, there'd be perhaps an easier way to go about building it. But no, even with green power, you have to jump through yards and reams and miles of paperwork. Environmental paperwork. You couldn't make it up. Perhaps the worst example of all of this is how our nuclear energy works in the United Kingdom. We get the French to build it, of course, and the French have been very good at building nuclear power. They get a vast majority of their electricity from nuclear power because they switched that way in the 1970s. But we don't think that the French designs for nuclear power stations are good enough. No, for every new power station that we try and build in the UK, it has to be completely redesigned. We have to apply our own regulations to it. We're using a prodigious amount more concrete than the French do in theirs. And we're using different systems to protect every single fish that might have the misfortune to be sucked up into the cooling system. I'm not joking. We're genuinely spending millions of pounds, and there's one consultation going forward for what's known or been pejoratively called fish discos. Fish discos. Yes, genuinely, underwater speakers placed to blast out loud noises, music to try and scare fish away from the cooling system. No other nuclear power station in the world operates with a fish disco underwater to try and ward off fish. If a couple of fish get in the cooling system, that's okay. The fish die. I mean, it's less than a trawler of fishermen would catch in a year, and yet we are potentially spending millions more on trying in an unproven way to ward away the fish. It's easy to see why we're building some of the most expensive nuclear power stations in the world. The South Koreans, meanwhile, build for 1/6 the cost of the Brits. Why is that? Well, they don't bother with fish discos. They use the same design time and time again. I mean, you'd think it would stand to reason that we would use the same design over and over again, but no, an entirely new regulatory process is needed every single time we want to build one. No wonder progress has been so slow. And that's only when the politicians are on board. For decades, we had politicians against nuclear power, the most powerful and safe form of energy that there is. I think we've basically had politicians who've given up on oil and gas. At least that's what it seems. We've refused to extract the natural gas that's underneath our feet. The Americans, by the way, they've been extracting it. So much so that we've been buying it. Yes, we've somehow convinced ourselves that the economically and environmentally friendly thing to do is to leave our gas in the ground and instead have the Americans drill their gas. We send them a huge quantity of money. They then freeze their gas down into a liquid and ship it halfway around the world, only for it to get to the United Kingdom, be unfrozen in an expensive and energy-intensive process for then us to use. Sounds like an awful number of steps. But that is genuinely what goes on. And it's more energy intensive than were we to simply extract our own gas in our own country. It's a mad world, and it all ties together, whether it's energy or transport. We've been building amongst the most expensive railway system that the world has ever seen. Yes, of course, I'm talking about HS2, a railway so silly that you will only get a couple of minutes of sunlight in the journey from London to Birmingham. Why is that? Through acres and acres of flat countryside, the boffins in charge of HS2 have decided that it should all be tunnelled. Yes, no one's allowed to look at a train, even going through a flat field. Tunnelling, of course, is incredibly expensive. If the train was just going above ground, as it easily could through miles and miles of flat land, well, that would have cost a lot less, but instead, we're going underground, we're digging, and we're cutting, and we're tunnelling. And that has increased the costs of the project so far. The Victorians would be rolling in their graves if they saw how we were constructing the railways that we now build in the United Kingdom. It doesn't stop there, just trying to protect someone's view. Personally, I think a view can be improved by a well-designed viaduct, by a glorious railway in the way that the Victorians did it. I mean, if you go to some of our cities around the United Kingdom today, the feature of that city is the Victorian viaduct. Think of places like Durham. Beautiful Victorian viaducts there. They make the city. Now we try and hide our trains and bury them underground for literally no reason. But that's not the only reason why HS2 is so expensive. No, in order to try and buy off some of the environmental opposition, as an aside, I think it is extraordinary that environmentalists have spent the best part of the last 20 years campaigning against a new train. Yes, the Green Party was campaigning against HS2. This is the same Green Party that doesn't want you to fly anymore. So if they don't want you to fly and they don't want new train lines, you'd be forgiven for thinking the Green Party don't want you to move at all. You might as well just stay in your hovel. Don't have a house. Don't heat your house, of course. Don't turn on your lights. Just stay in your cave, eat moss and be happy. But I digress. Clearly what has happened is there's been so many different environmental offsets over the course of the HS2 railway, whether that's very noble ambitions like cycle tracks built alongside it, entire nature reserves created as well. All things that are very nice to have, but aren't exactly needed to build a train from London to Birmingham. The worst example of this is the Bat Tunnel. I don't know if you've heard of the Bat Tunnel, but I'm about to tell you about it now. £100 million of British taxpayers' money spent to protect a colony of 300 bats that may or may not have been at risk from this train. Yes, the HS2 railway cuts through a wood where we think 300 bats may live. And to protect their potential migration patterns, a complicated web of tunnel-like structure must be created over the railway. This is to help the bats not get confused by the trains. 300 bats to be protected, £100 million. It's easy to see how the infrastructure we're trying to build in the United Kingdom gets so expensive, becomes so bad. We are wasting money hand over foot. Why are we spending more on transport infrastructure for bats than we are spending on transport infrastructure for many of our towns in the Midlands and the North? It's a crazy system that we've entered into, and part of this is because of all of the laws that we've kept from the European Union. Yes, it was the Habitats Directive that specifies that this particular form of bat can never be harmed. Elsewhere on the list are things like newts. Newts and bats hold up projects the country over because they're on this protected European list. We left the European Union, didn't we? I hear you ask. Yes, we did, but we kept most of their laws. And this is one of the reasons things feel so sclerotic in the United Kingdom today. We've left the European Union, but have kept the European way of managing our economy. It's no wonder that we're feeling so down in the dumps, that our growth is so low. So's the growth in Germany. So's the growth in France and in Italy. All the major European economies are struggling to get far over 1% growth per annum. Meanwhile, the Americans are experiencing more than double our European rates of growth. The Americans are sending rockets to space. Meanwhile, the Europeans are attaching bottle caps to plastic bottles. It's easy to see where things have gone wrong. But why on earth is it that our politicians, after taking back control from the European Union, have decided to maintain and retain most of that European legislation? You'd think that one of the great benefits of leaving the European Union would be to regulate things differently, would be to not have to spend £100 million to protect 100 bats, would not be to spend tens of millions of pounds for underwater fish discos to just try and ward off some European protected fish from our nuclear power stations. You'd think that we could change these rules, and yet our politicians have been so lily-livered that they might have some environmental protest groups say that that would be the wrong thing to do. We've got the levers in front of these politicians. We've got all the tools for growth. They're sitting right there in front of the ministers of this government. They simply refuse to pull them. They're refusing to pull those growth levers because they're afraid. And that is a terrible state for our country to be in. We only have to look at some of the biggest growth areas of the world. Look at the United States tech sector. AI is taking off in a huge way. It's going to transform the way that we live our lives. In some ways, it already is. And yet, the newest systems, whether it's SOAR from OpenAI, or whether it's the newest Meta form of AI large language model, they're not available in Europe. They're not available in the European Economic Area. Many are not available in the UK too. Why? European regulation. It's a remarkable state of affairs when SOAR, that remarkable video software from OpenAI, is available in Afghanistan before it's available in Brussels. What a world to live in. And yet the EU, in their wisdom, passed what's known as the EU AI Act. It's driven an exodus of tech talent away from Europe, and sadly the United Kingdom is not far behind that tech exodus. London and Cambridge and Oxford stand out, yes, but we still suffer under GDPR, that European law of data protection that has prevented many of these AI systems rolling out in the UK. We're being left behind because we're keeping this level of regulation from Brussels. This Brussels era regulation is still strangling our economy, despite the fact that the United Kingdom has left the EU. There's a real opportunity there. There's a real opportunity to unshackle the country from so much of that European legacy regulation. And therein lies the hope. Because while everything feels broken in the United Kingdom, whilst it feels that the prices are going up, that the jobs are getting more scarce, whilst it feels like the country is on its knees, the irony is the solutions, they're not difficult. They're not impossible to see. They're just hard for politicians to accept. Those solutions are the solutions that are being tried by a man by the name of Javier Milei. He became the president of Argentina last year, and he's thrown off the regulations that suffered that country, that suffocated that country. He's made it easier to build houses, even easier to rent out houses. He's cut state spending prodigiously. And now that country is growing at 5%. It's a remarkable success story. When you get the government off your back, you grow and you blossom. There's some lessons for politicians in the UK to look out there. One of the strange things about a country like Great Britain, about a country like the United Kingdom, is that we were the first country in the world to industrialise. We were the first country in the world to get rich. And we've walked around with that reputation for now getting on for 200 years. But the trouble is, other countries are overtaking us. We all tell ourselves that we're a rich country, and that was true for a very long time. But other countries are overtaking us. We can't rest on our laurels. In some ways, policymakers need to think of the UK less as an advanced economy to tinker around with science policy here or innovation internships there. To some extent, we need to think of ourselves as a developing country. Why do I say that? It's not the finesse of policy that needs to be twiddled. It's the basics. It's the cost of energy. It's the ease of getting around. Energy, transport, homes. Those basics that anyone would tell any developing country that they need to get right. We're in the peculiar situation where boffins from London travel over to developing countries in Africa and say, you need to build energy infrastructure. But those same boffins are not telling that to us here in the United Kingdom. We need to think more like a developing country. We need to think more of what the basics are, not complicated policy at the high level, simple policy at the base of things. Because you don't need an industrial strategy to protect one company or other that are going under because of the high cost of energy. You don't need to twiddle with the end of that process. Fix the start of it. Why are these companies going under? Why are these jobs going? Why are we not creating steel in the United Kingdom anymore? Because energy is too expensive. Make it easier to produce energy, you fix a lot of those problems that knock on later down the line. The same is true of housing. Housing is more expensive in this country than almost any other place around the world. We don't build enough. It's very simple. Per person, we have about 4 million fewer homes than the average European country does. That's an insane statistic. 4 million fewer homes than just the average European country. And the average European country has a lot fewer homes than, for example, the United States of America does on average. Why? Because of the legacy of communism in the Eastern European states. So we need to build more than 4 million homes. We need to bring the cost of that rent down. We need to make it normal for people to have second homes. Why is that such a strange thing in France? That's less of a strange thing, might I add. There is so much to do to the UK economy, and so much of it is so very basic. It starts with one simple mantra. Get the government off our back. Well, I've been Tom Harwood for the GB News Originals series, and I hope you subscribe for some of these videos that will be slightly less depressing than that state of affairs, than the sclerotic assessment of this country and where we are right now. But you know what? One thing to end on. It's always darkest before the dawn.